I love you so much, Dad. And I know you are gonna be fine, Dad. I love you so much.
Daniel, I know what you are trying to do. You are trying to win Dad's favor and inherit all this, right?
Anthony Ashford was 71 years old, and he had not cried since the funeral of the woman he loved. On the night this story begins, he sat alone in the study of his estate outside Greenwich, Connecticut, a glass of untouched bourbon sweating on the desk beside him, and a folder in his hands with 3 words typed across the front. Terminal diagnosis, confidential. He had built an empire that stretched from coastal resorts in the Carolinas to glass towers in Manhattan, and yet on this particular evening, all of that fortune meant nothing to him. Because Anthony Ashford was about to do something no father should ever have to do. He was about to find out, once and for all, which of his 3 children actually loved him, and which of them had simply been waiting, patiently, politely, for him to die. He thought of his children one by one, the way a man reviews a ledger before closing the books for the night. Marcus, his eldest, sharp and hungry, a son who had never once asked how his father was feeling, without also asking what it meant for the company. Victoria, his only daughter, beautiful and brittle, a woman who had spent so many years polishing the family name that she had forgotten what her own reflection looked like without an audience watching. And Daniel, his youngest, the one who had walked away from all of it 6 years earlier, the one Anthony had not spoken a full sentence to since the day Daniel chose a non-profit organization over a corner office. 3 children, 3 strangers, wearing his last name. By morning, all 3 of them would receive the same phone call. Their father was dying. The diagnosis was aggressive, the doctors said, and there was very little time left. What none of them would know, not for months, was that the diagnosis did not exist. There was no illness eating away at Anthony Ashford's body. There was only a test, carefully designed, quietly executed, meant to strip away every polite smile and every dutiful phone call his children had ever given him, and reveal what was underneath. Somewhere in the coming weeks, one child would show up in person before being asked twice. One child would reach for a lawyer before reaching for a tissue, and one child would do something that would surprise even Anthony himself. By the end of this story, you will know exactly which of Anthony Ashford's children loved him, and which of them only loved what he could leave behind. But first, we need to go back to where all of this truly began, long before the folder, long before the fake diagnosis, back to the year everything in this family quietly started to break. To understand why a father would go to such extreme lengths to test the people who share his blood, you first need to understand who these 3 children actually were. Marcus Ashford, 45 years old, was the chief operating officer of his father's company, a man who had spent 2 decades proving himself in boardrooms, convinced that the empire should already carry his name instead of his father's. Victoria Ashford Kane, 42, had married into a politically connected family and had built her entire adult identity around appearances, terrified of what she would be without the weight of the Ashford name behind her. And Daniel Ashford, 37, had walked away from a guaranteed executive seat 6 years earlier to run a struggling community housing nonprofit that his father had never once acknowledged out loud. 3 questions will follow all 3 of these children through every single moment of what comes next. Which one of them is faking their concern for a dying man? Which one of them is genuinely willing to give up their share of a $2.3 billion fortune if it meant proving their love was real? And what will Anthony Ashford do once the truth is finally sitting in front of him, with nowhere left to hide? Before we go further, let us know in the comments where you're watching from tonight, and if this is your first time here, subscribe, because these family stories only get more unbelievable from here. Now, let's go back to the beginning, because the real test in this story had not even started yet. Anthony Ashford, did not start his life as a billionaire. He started it behind the front desk of a single roadside motel in Connecticut, a building his own father had mortgaged twice just to keep the lights on. Anthony was 19 years old when he took over that motel, and by the time he was 30, he had turned it into a small chain of highway inns. By 50, that chain had become one of the largest privately held hospitality and real estate companies on the East Coast. He built all of it alongside his wife, Margaret Ashford, a woman who remembered every employee's name and who used to say that money was only useful if it made the people around you feel safer, not smaller. Anthony believed that too, once. Somewhere along the way, he stopped being sure. Margaret died of a sudden heart condition 8 years before this story begins, and her death did something to this family that none of them ever fully recovered from. Marcus, who had always measured his father's love in approval and results, threw himself even harder into the company, convinced that if he could just be indispensable enough, his father would finally see him the way he used to see Margaret. Victoria, who had always been closest to her mother, married within 2 years of the funeral, choosing a husband from a prominent political family, as though a new name could fill the space Margaret left behind. And Daniel, the son who had inherited his mother's quiet compassion rather than his father's ambition, began drifting further from the family business with every passing year, until the distance became permanent. The break finally came 6 years ago, when Anthony offered Daniel a guaranteed executive position inside the company, the kind of opportunity most people would never turn down. Daniel refused it. He told his father, in front of the entire family at Sunday dinner, that he did not want to spend his life managing hotels he would never sleep in himself. He wanted to build affordable housing for families who could not otherwise afford a roof over their heads. Anthony called it an insult. Daniel called it the truth. Neither of them spoke more than a few clipped words to each other for the next 6 years, and the silence between them grew so wide that even Margaret's absence seemed smaller by comparison. Margaret used to keep a small notebook in the kitchen drawer, filled with birthdays of employees, notes about which housekeeper's mother was recovering from surgery, which groundskeeper's daughter had just started college. After she died, Anthony found that notebook while clearing out her desk, and for a long time he could not bring himself to close the drawer again. He began to notice, in the months that followed, that his own children rarely asked about anyone but themselves. Marcus asked about quarterly earnings. Victoria asked about seating charts for events. Daniel, at least, still asked about people, but by then he had already stopped asking about his father. There was a particular Christmas, 4 years after Margaret's death, that Anthony still thought about often. He had gathered all 3 children at the estate, hoping the holiday might soften whatever had grown between them. Instead, dinner ended in an argument about the family trust before dessert was even served. Marcus and Victoria trading accusations across the table, while Daniel sat silently at the far end, eventually excusing himself before the meal was finished. Anthony remembered watching his children leave that night in 3 separate cars, none of them speaking to one another, and thinking, for the first time, that perhaps the fortune he had built to protect this family had instead become the very thing tearing it apart. By the time this story truly begins, Anthony Ashford was a man surrounded by wealth and starving for something money could never buy him, which was certainty. Late one night, sitting across from Walter Reyes, the butler who had worked in this house for over 3 decades, and the only person Anthony trusted completely, Anthony finally said the thing he had been carrying for months. He no longer knew who his children were. He only knew who they pretended to be whenever he was in the room. Walter did not argue with him. He simply asked his employer a single, quiet question. What was Anthony prepared to do to finally find out the truth? Anthony did not answer that night. But 3 weeks later, he had his answer, and it involved a folder marked confidential, a physician willing to lie for him, and a plan that would change everything. Dr. Elaine Foster had been Anthony Ashford's personal physician for 20 years, and she knew this family almost as well as she knew her own. When Anthony first brought the idea to her, sitting in her private office long after the last patient of the day had gone home, she told him plainly that what he was asking her to do crossed every ethical line she had built her career around. Anthony did not argue with her either. He simply told her that he was 71 years old, that he had already buried the only person who ever loved him without condition, and that he refused to die not knowing whether his own children would do the same. Dr. Foster sat with that for a long time. Eventually, she agreed, on one condition. The moment the truth came out, Anthony would tell his children everything, no matter how it ended. Together, they built a diagnosis that would hold up under any scrutiny. Fabricated scans, falsified lab results. A story about an aggressive, fast-moving illness that gave Anthony only a matter of months to live. Anthony chose to deliver the news to each of his children separately, in private, so that he could watch their first reaction before any of them had time to compose themselves for an audience. He was not interested in the words they would say. Words had always come easily to this family. He was interested in the very first thing each of them reached for. Before they remembered, they were supposed to be sad. Marcus was the first to receive the news, seated across from his father, in the same study where all of this had started. His face fell for exactly as long as it takes to inhale once, and then his mind moved somewhere else entirely. Within an hour, he was on the phone with the family's longtime attorney, discussing what he called a responsible restructuring of company shares, framing it as something he was doing to protect his father's legacy. Victoria received the news over the phone, from 3,000 miles away, and within a day she had already begun contacting a handful of press connections, quietly shaping the narrative of her father's illness into a story the public would sympathize with, one that happened to center her own image at the heart of it. Daniel was different. He received the same phone call his siblings did, and within hours, he had canceled every appointment on his calendar at the nonprofit he had built from nothing, packed a single bag, and driven straight to his father's estate without being asked to come at all. He did not call a lawyer. He did not call the press. He simply showed up, sat down beside his father, and asked what he needed. It was the first real conversation the two of them had shared in 6 years. Over the following days, the pattern each child had set in motion during those first few hours only grew more defined. Marcus scheduled 3 separate meetings with the attorney within the same week, each one framed as urgent, each one somehow requiring Anthony's signature on a different piece of paperwork. He rarely visited the estate in person, preferring instead to send updates through email, always signed with some version of the phrase, "thinking of you constantly," followed immediately by another attachment requiring review. Victoria called twice that week, both calls under 10 minutes, both ending with her asking whether a particular reporter had reached out to the family yet, and whether Anthony would be comfortable with a carefully worded statement she had already drafted on his behalf. Daniel, meanwhile, had quietly rearranged his entire life around his father's supposed illness. He handed leadership of his nonprofit to his most trusted deputy, gave up the small apartment he had been renting near the organization's offices, and began sleeping most nights in the guest house, close enough to hear if his father needed anything after midnight. He learned to read the labels on Anthony's medication bottles, learned which of Dr. Foster's phone calls meant good news and which meant a harder conversation was coming, and never once, in all of that time, mentioned the word inheritance out loud. Late that same week, Walter Reyes came across something that troubled him deeply. Buried in a stack of forwarded emails on the household computer, he found a fragment of a message, suggesting that one of Anthony's children might already suspect the diagnosis was not entirely what it appeared to be. Walter said nothing to Anthony that night. He wanted to be certain first. But somewhere inside this family, someone already knew more than they were letting on, and that single discovery would change the direction of everything that followed. In the weeks that followed, each of Anthony's children revealed a little more of themselves than they ever intended to. Marcus grew more insistent by the day, framing every conversation about the company as an act of love rather than what it truly was, which was an attempt to secure his position before his father's mind could change. He proposed an early transfer of operational control, calling it a matter of tax efficiency and long-term planning, when in truth, it was simply the fastest way to make sure the empire belonged to him before anyone else could contest it. Anthony listened to every proposal his son brought to him, said very little in response, and quietly noted exactly how quickly his son's grief had turned into paperwork. Victoria, meanwhile, had recently been at the center of a public scandal involving her husband's political career, and her father's illness gave her something she badly needed, which was a new story for the public to focus on instead. She appeared at a high-profile charity gala only days after learning of the diagnosis, tears carefully timed for the cameras, describing her father's condition to reporters in language clearly designed to repair her own reputation. Behind closed doors, she rarely called to check on him at all. In front of an audience, she had never seemed more devoted. Daniel, without any fanfare, moved into the guest house on his father's property. He learned Anthony's medication schedule by heart, sat with him through every appointment with Dr. Foster, and never once brought up the subject of the company or the will. One evening, a bitter argument broke out between Daniel and Marcus in the kitchen of the main house, Marcus accusing his younger brother of only returning now that there was suddenly something worth inheriting. Daniel did not defend himself with words. He simply reminded Marcus that he had walked away from a guaranteed fortune 6 years earlier and had not asked for a single dollar since coming back. Around this same time, Anthony began quietly recording private video messages for each of his children, unsure whether he would ever get another chance to say the things he needed to say. He recorded one for Marcus about ambition and what it costs a person in the end. He recorded one for Victoria about the difference between being loved and being watched. And he recorded one for Daniel that he could not finish in a single take, because his voice kept breaking every time he tried to say how proud he was. One afternoon, Marcus arrived at the estate with a stack of documents nearly an inch thick, laying them across his father's desk, with the practiced ease of a man who had rehearsed the conversation in the car on the way over. He explained, in careful language, that transferring operational authority now would protect the company from any disruption if Anthony's condition worsened suddenly, and that waiting any longer could expose the family to unnecessary risk. Anthony listened to the entire proposal without interrupting once, then asked his son a single question. Had Marcus discussed any of this with his siblings first? Marcus admitted that he had not. Anthony signed nothing that day, but he kept every page Marcus had left behind, filing each one away as evidence rather than agreement. Victoria's appearance at the gala became, in its own way, the moment that defined her role in this story most clearly. Photographers captured her dabbing at her eyes as she described her father's condition to a small circle of reporters, her voice trembling at exactly the right moments, her husband's hand resting supportively on her shoulder for the cameras. The story ran in 3 separate outlets by the following morning, each one focusing more on Victoria's grace under pressure than on Anthony's health itself. When Walter later asked her, gently, whether she had called her father since the gala, Victoria admitted that she had not found the time. Daniel's days had settled into a quiet rhythm by then, one built entirely around his father's needs rather than his own. He drove Anthony to appointments, sat beside him during long stretches of silence neither of them tried to fill, and slowly, without either of them fully noticing, the 6 years of distance between father and son began to soften into something closer to the relationship they once had. It was during one of these quiet evenings that Marcus arrived unannounced, furious after learning that Daniel had been present for a private conversation with Dr. Foster that Marcus had not been invited to. The argument that followed was loud enough that Walter heard it from the hallway. Marcus accused his younger brother of returning only now that the company was finally within reach. Daniel reminded him, calmly, that he had walked away from that same company 6 years earlier without a single complaint, and that he had not asked for $1 of it since coming back. Then, without warning, a letter arrived from the family's attorney, suggesting that Anthony had already quietly altered the terms of his will. The letter offered no details, only enough information to throw all 3 siblings into open conflict with one another for the first time in years. Marcus accused Victoria of manipulating their father behind his back. Victoria accused Daniel of playing the long game all along. And somewhere in the middle of all that noise, Anthony Ashford sat quietly in his study, watching his own children turn on each other exactly the way he had feared they might. Walter's earlier suspicion turned out to be correct. Victoria's husband, using his political connections, had quietly requested an independent review of Anthony's medical records, and what he found did not add up. The scans were inconsistent. The timeline of the illness did not match the physician's own notes. Somewhere in that review, the truth of the fabricated diagnosis had started to surface, and Victoria was the first of Anthony's children to learn that her father was not actually dying at all. Rather than confront her father directly, Victoria made a decision that would define her role in this story far more than any tearful appearance ever could. She chose to keep the secret to herself and instead used it as leverage, quietly pressuring Anthony to guarantee her a fixed portion of the estate in exchange for her silence. It was, in its own way, the clearest answer Anthony had received so far. His daughter had learned her father was lying about dying, and her very first instinct had been to negotiate a price for keeping quiet about it. Unaware that his cover had already been partially exposed, Anthony made the decision to escalate the plan even further, staging a sudden and severe medical decline designed to see exactly how far each of his children would go once his death appeared to be only days away rather than months. Marcus, believing the end was finally near, moved quickly to finalize paperwork that would grant him full operational control of the company overnight, convinced that speed mattered more than his father's wishes at this point. Daniel, who still believed every word of the diagnosis, was the only one of the 3 children at his father's bedside when Anthony staged his collapse, a moment engineered specifically to see whether his youngest son would stay. The staged decline unfolded over the course of a single, carefully arranged evening. Dr. Foster arrived at the estate under the pretense of an emergency visit, informing the family that Anthony's condition had suddenly and severely worsened, and that the coming hours would likely determine how much time he truly had left. Marcus, reached by phone at his office in the city, spent the next several hours coordinating with the attorney rather than driving to his father's side, convinced that securing the paperwork mattered more urgently than being present in the room. Victoria, informed by her husband of the same news, chose to remain at a scheduled public event rather than cancel her appearance, later explaining to Anthony that she had not wanted to alarm anyone by leaving early. Daniel stayed. He did not call the office. He did not call a lawyer. He sat beside his father through the entire night, holding his hand, telling him quietly that none of the last 6 years of silence between them had ever changed how much Daniel loved him. Later that night, once the room had gone quiet, Anthony turned to Walter, his voice barely above a whisper, and said that he already had his answer about 2 of his 3 children. He did not yet say which 2, but anyone watching this family closely already knew. A week later, Anthony Ashford gathered all three of his children in the same study where this entire story had begun, and told them the truth. There was no illness. There had never been an illness. The diagnosis had been fabricated from the very beginning, designed to reveal exactly what each of his children would do if they believed their father's death was close enough to touch. Marcus reacted first, and his reaction told Anthony everything he needed to know. Rather than relief, rather than gratitude that his father was healthy after all, Marcus's fury centered entirely on the paperwork he had rushed to finalize. Paperwork that, as it turned out, had never been legally valid to begin with, since Anthony had quietly instructed the family's attorney weeks earlier not to process anything without his direct final approval. Victoria's secret came out only moments later, when Anthony calmly revealed that he had known about her husband's investigation and about her attempt to trade her silence for a guaranteed inheritance, for several days already. The image she had spent the entire ordeal so carefully protecting collapsed in front of the only two witnesses whose opinion she claimed to value most. Daniel sat in stunned silence, processing the fact that the father he had just spent weeks caring for through what he believed was a terminal illness had never been sick at all. But Anthony did not let that silence last long. He told his youngest son, in front of his older siblings, that Daniel had passed the only test that had ever truly mattered to him. Anthony then revealed what he had already quietly finalized with his attorney over the previous several weeks. The company, along with the majority of the family's fortune, would go to Daniel, while Marcus and Victoria would be required to earn any future involvement in the business through years of demonstrated trust, rather than simply inheriting it by right of birth. In the months that followed, each of Richard's children settled into the consequences of what the test had revealed. Marcus remained at the company, though in a reduced role, required to rebuild his father's trust one decision at a time rather than one signature at a time. It was, Anthony told him privately, the only path back that Marcus had left, and whether his son would take it seriously remained an open question neither of them could yet answer. Victoria's marriage did not survive the scandal that followed once details of her attempted leverage became known within her husband's political circle, and for the first time in her adult life, she found herself building an identity that did not depend on either the Ashford name or her husband's. Daniel returned to his nonprofit within weeks, now with the full backing of his father's foundation behind him, quietly turning down most of the personal fortune he had inherited in favor of directing it toward the housing projects he had spent 6 years fighting for on his own. In the end, Anthony Ashford did not need a real illness to learn the truth about the people who share his blood. He only needed his children to believe, even for a short while, that he was already gone. So we leave you with the same question Anthony was forced to sit with for months. If the people closest to you believed they were about to lose you forever, would their very first instinct be to hold you closer, or to start dividing up what you would leave behind? Would you have passed Richard's test, or would grief have quietly revealed your true motives first? Let us know what you think in the comments below. Before you go, we want to hear from you directly. Of the 3 Ashford children in this story, which one did you see the most of yourself in, and why? Was it Marcus, who mistook control for love? Was it Victoria, who mistook appearances for devotion? Or was it Daniel, who simply showed up without asking what showing up would cost him? Tell us in the comments below, because we read every single one of them. And if this story moved you even a little, wait until you hear the one we have coming next. An even more shocking inheritance story involving a family fortune, a hidden letter, and a secret that stayed buried for over 20 years. Make sure you are subscribed and have your notifications turned on, so you never miss the next chapter in these real family stories that remind us what money can and cannot buy. As for Anthony Ashford, he spent that final evening exactly where this story began, alone in his study, the folder that once read, "Terminal Diagnosis, Confidential," now empty on the desk in front of him. But for the first time in 8 years, since the day he lost Margaret, Anthony Ashford finally felt something close to peace. Not because he was dying, but because, at last, he knew exactly who his children really were.